My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of Old Testament prophets and kings, and scheming scoundrels too, collected in this book, Exile of the Chosen, God's Heroes from Solomon to Malachi. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words Parental Guidance Recommended. Chapter 2, Part 1, Elisheba. Elisheba crouched near the doorway, straining to hear what was being said. Grandfather Nathan had called a secret family meeting. Both of her uncles were there, and 3 of their eldest sons. The girl had had a prickling at the back of her neck that someone was watching her, or talking about her. And while it seemed pretty far-fetched, she just had to know what they were saying. So many things had happened that week that had left her confused and worried. The king was dead. Now Prince Rehoboam would be the new king. The whole land grieved for King Solomon. He had been a wise and good king. Elisheba had seen him several times when he had addressed the country or worshipped at the temple. This was the first time anyone important that she knew of had died, since she had been too young to remember the death of her father. Elisheba! Hearing her name, she jumped and looked up guiltily. "What are you doing here?" her mother demanded. "Come back out and help me with the cooking. We must prepare something for these men." She smiled and winked. The girl grinned to herself. Mother wanted to know as badly as she did what was going on. "What do you think they're talking about?" Elisheba asked. "I don't know," her mother whispered. "There's a lot going on, but I have a hunch it's not about the weather, or they wouldn't be hiding in the back room whispering among themselves." "Our uncles and cousins are here," Elisheba said. "Everyone who is of age." She wrinkled her nose. If she were a boy, she would be almost old enough to be a man now. Instead, she was just a girl and would never be included in these kind of meetings. "Well, if they were just chatting about King Rehoboam's coronation," Mother said, "they could do that out in the courtyard. Here, you carry this platter, and I'll bring something for them to drink." The 2 quietly pulled back the curtain that covered the doorway to the room in the back.
"Wouldn't that be considered treason?"
Uncle Seth asked.
"I guess that depends where you are at the time,"
his brother Reuben retorted.
"If you're in Rehoboam's court, then yes, it would be treason, but if you're in Jeroboam's court, then it would be considered loyal behavior."
The conversation stopped abruptly as the men realized the curtain had moved. "We brought you something to eat," Elisheba's mother said as she set the platter in the center of the room and the jug of grape juice beside it. "Thank you," Grandfather Nathan said. Elisheba's uncles just looked at the floor, but her cousins stared at her curiously. "What?" she asked as she saw the questioning look in their faces.
"Never mind,"
her cousin Joab said.
"This conversation's not for women."
Mother made a small coughing noise, but said nothing. Grandfather Nathan smiled. "Eventually it will affect everyone in this family," he said. Elisheba and her mother left the room. "See," Mother said, "they're talking about the coronation and Jeroboam." "Who's Jeroboam?" Elisheba asked. "Jeroboam was around a while back. When King Solomon married so many women from other countries, he started building them temples to their gods so they would have a place to worship and not be so homesick." "Wasn't that wrong?" Elisheba interrupted. "Isn't that disloyal to our God?" Mother nodded. "Yes, and the Lord thought so too. Your father told me that the prophet Ahijah went to Jeroboam one day and tore his robe in half." "Why? Clothing is too expensive." "Apparently the prophet told Jeroboam that God was going to tear the kingdom in half. Not even really in half. He was going to give the smaller piece to Solomon's sons, and the larger piece to Jeroboam. But God told Jeroboam he didn't want him to do anything about this until Solomon died. None of us really knew whether it was a true story or not, although it was a rumor that many people believed. But the next thing we knew, Jeroboam had fled to Egypt and was staying in the court of King Shishak. Now, within a week of Solomon's death, here he is back in Israel again. Makes you wonder." Elisheba looked thoughtful. "Do you think that Grandfather and our men are trying to decide which king to be loyal to?" Well, there's only one king right now. It's Rehoboam. But if the rumor is true, and if God really does divide the kingdom, then I guess everyone will have to decide who should receive their allegiance." Elisheba didn't say anything for a moment, then asked, Who are you going to be loyal to?" Mother laughed. "We don't get to choose, Elisheba. Remember, we will be a part of Grandfather Nathan's household, and whoever he gives his allegiance to, we will be loyal to also." Elisheba's shoulders sagged for a minute. Then she perked up. "But you've always said that Grandfather Nathan was very wise and a godly man, so he'll choose the right king, won't he?" "Of course," Mother said as she hugged Elisheba, "and no matter how things turn out, it will be fine. We will live here with your grandfather and your uncles, and they will take care of us, and we'll all get to stay together because of your little brother." "Why because of him?" "Because he's your father's heir. So we'll be fine. Life would be very different if I had been childless when your father died." Elisheba had heard of other widows and the terrible times they had had. Life was good here on Grandfather Nathan's family compound, and even though the family had not been as prosperous as most Levites had been during the time when the temple was first built, life was still good. As King Solomon became distracted by his foreign wives and their gods, Mother continued, many in Israel began worshipping the foreign gods also. They stopped attending the temple. Since the Levites depended on the gifts and offerings brought to the temple, this meant there was less to go around. Will King Rehoboam worship God like King Solomon did? I don't know about him. Sometimes he seems committed and sincere in his worship, then other times, well, she shrugged. Perhaps he can't help it. His mother was an Ammonite. I think Prince Rehoboam has always felt pulled two ways. But now that he is the king, he'll have to make up his mind. Perhaps that's what the men are talking of too. If the story about Prophet Ahijah and Jeroboam is true, Elisheba said pensively, then perhaps God felt that Jeroboam would worship him and lead the country in a more godly way than Prince Rehoboam. Perhaps, but we don't know about any of this, and it would be very dangerous to speak of it where anyone else could hear you. You're old enough to know some of these important secrets, but you must be very careful. Elisheba nodded. I certainly will. It wasn't long after Elisheba had laid down on her sleeping mat in the room she shared with her mother before the men completed their secret meeting. The girl had not fallen asleep yet. She strained her ears to pick up the whispered conversations as they headed for their respective sleeping spaces in the family enclosure.
I still think we should offer Elisheba as a wife to him.
Her ears perked up. She recognized Uncle Seth's voice.
You know Father would never let us do that.
Another voice replied.
But why?
Seth protested.
True, she's not royalty, but she could be a concubine, and that would give us a basis of power and access to Jeroboam's court. If things didn't work out well and we decided to stick with Rehoboam, it wouldn't be a problem either. She's only a girl and a niece. It's not as if we're giving one of our daughters.
I agree,
her other uncle answered.
The plan has merit, but our father has determined that she should marry some respectable Levite and raise a whole family of little Levites and have the same financial problems that all the rest of us do.
Oh,
Uncle Seth growled.
Maybe we can talk him into a compromise. He certainly is a stubborn old man.
Elisheba leaned against the wall as she sat in the darkness. She felt as if her heart was pounding so loudly it would give her away. Had she heard correctly? Surely she was misunderstanding them. Were they really thinking of giving her as a wife to Jeroboam? He was older, and besides he had a wife. She stared out the window at the twinkling stars for what seemed like hours. The lump in her throat wouldn't go away. Finally, she gathered her courage about her and crept out the door and across the courtyard. Carefully she slipped in through the curtain covering Grandfather's door. Grandfather, Grandfather, she whispered.
Elisheba, what are you doing up so late?
He said from the darkness. I couldn't sleep, and I'm scared.
Why are you afraid, Elisheba? Did you hear something? You know we have a sturdy gate with a heavy beam barring it. No one can break in here and hurt you."
"That's not what I heard," she whispered guiltily.
Come sit here by me. And here, put this around you. It's chilly in the middle of the night this time of year."
Grandfather handed her his daytime cloak. She wrapped up in it and then leaned against him.
"You heard some of your uncle's discussion," he said flatly.
She nodded, and even though it was dark, Grandfather Nathan understood. "They said they wouldn't give their daughters, but because I was only a niece, I didn't matter," she blurted. Grandfather put his arm around her.
"You matter," he said firmly. "They were wrong to say that."
"Are you really going to send me away from here? To marry him?"
"No, we are not. As long as I'm head of this household, I'm the one to make those decisions."
The girl took a deep breath and let it out with a sigh of relief.
"Elisheba," he said gently, "you understand that when girls reach marriageable age, they do leave home."
"But, Grandfather, I'm not quite that age yet." He smiled in the darkness and hugged her closer.
"I know. And I'm glad you're not. It's hard to imagine you all grown up and living somewhere else as someone's wife. But you do know that that will happen someday."
"Yes."
"Meanwhile, there are many things happening in our country that make circumstances different than they were a week ago. Your uncles and I are trying to decide what to do, what would be best for our whole family."
Elisheba squeezed his arm in agreement.
"And even more important than being loyal to the family," he continued, "is your loyalty to God."
"I am loyal to God," she protested.
"Oh, yes, I know. Your love for the God of Israel is one of the things that has bound you and I so closely, more so than my other grandchildren."
Elisheba smiled to herself. It was true. Grandfather Nathan loved the God of Israel. He worked at the temple as one of the assistant instructors to the new members of the choir. They said that he knew every psalm King David had ever written, and most of the rest of them. He had taught many of them to Elisheba, and she loved to sing them with him.
"It is my plan," Grandfather explained, "that you will marry a good Levite man when you're old enough. However, our family has had some financial problems, and we do need to think of other things."
"Like which king?"
"Where did you hear that?" he demanded.
"Just talk," she said guiltily.
"Be very careful, and don't say anything until we see what happens with our country," he cautioned. "Such talk can be very dangerous if it's heard by the wrong person."
"I'll be careful," she whispered. "Tell me about Jeroboam."
"You have heard the discussions, haven't you? There are lots of rumors about. I will tell you what is truth if you promise not to ask anyone else questions."
"I promise," she said solemnly. Grandfather Nathan drew a deep breath.
"Jeroboam is a good man. He was one of King Solomon's mighty men of valor and a highly skilled soldier. In addition, he supervised the men doing temporary service for the king in the district of the house of Joseph. Organizing the local labor, he directed them on several construction projects for the king."
"He sounds like an important man," Elisheba said.
"Yes, and a man gifted with strong leadership skills."
"Is the story about the prophet Ahijah true?"
"Yes, and because of that, Jeroboam has been living in Egypt for his own safety. But he's back. Prince Rehoboam is heading for Shechem. We think he's planning the coronation there, and have been wondering if Jeroboam is going to make his move then."
"Will it be dangerous? Will there be fighting?"
"I don't know," Grandfather answered slowly. "None of the men in this family will lift a sword against the Lord's anointed king. It's just that both of these men seem to be anointed. One is the son of Solomon, the other was called to be king by the prophet Ahijah. We are very confused. But Jeroboam has always been loyal to the God of Israel. Rehoboam, well, sometimes it seems it depends on the weather."
Suddenly Grandfather changed the subject.
"The wife of Jeroboam is very young."
"How young?"
"A few years older than you. This is a difficult time for her, too, and she needs a companion and a maidservant. I'm making arrangements for you to go to the house of Jeroboam and be a maidservant and companion to his young wife."
"Is that different than what my uncles were saying?"
"Absolutely. They wanted to give you to Jeroboam himself. Being a companion and a maidservant to his wife is not the same. You will belong to her and you will care for her, but you will return to our family when we have found a husband for you and when I have a suitable dowry."
Elisheba caught her breath. She didn't know whether to be relieved or to burst into tears. While she was leaving home, at least she wasn't being married off to someone she didn't know. Not yet, anyway. Grandfather hugged her.
"These will be difficult days," he said. "I know you will be lonely and I will miss you terribly, but it may be a safer place for you right now. And you will be in a wealthier home until we get back on our feet financially here. Just remember that wherever you are, the God of Israel will be with you and you can always talk to him. You'll never be alone."
"I will always remember that, Grandfather."
"Now," said Grandfather gruffly, "get back to your bed before morning. You don't want to be still sitting up when the sun rises, otherwise you'll be exhausted tomorrow."
Elisheba bit her lip. "I love you, Grandpa." After giving him a hug, she scampered back across the courtyard. I watched my young charge toss and turn the remainder of the night. By the time she had awakened in the morning, decisions had been made, provisions had been packed, and she had only time for a brief and careful goodbye to her mother before she, her grandfather, and her uncles set out for the gathering of the men of Israel. First, though, they went to the home of Jeroboam in Shechem. "Your granddaughter Elisheba is welcome here," he told Grandfather. "I received your message, and in honor of the respect that my father Nebat had for you and your friendship with him, I will care for her respectfully in my home as long as she is a guest here." Elisheba was surprised. She didn't know that Grandfather Nathan had been friends with Nebat, the father of Jeroboam. I smiled. There were lots of things she didn't know. "This is my wife Sarah. She'll be pleased to have a young companion. The only other women in our family compound are some older servants." Jeroboam's wife smiled shyly at the girl. Before long, the men had left, and the two girls were alone together. I was thankful that the Mighty One had planned to put these girls together, for both were young and lonely and needed the friendship of each other. I was even more glad that he had posted extra guardians around her, for the entire country was restless and impending conflict seemed to lurk everywhere. Today the men in Israel were going to meet with young Prince Rehoboam and make plans for the coronation. The girls spent very little time worrying about that, as Sarah showed Elisheba around the compound and they got to know each other. "Your home is almost the same size as Grandfather Nathan's home near Jerusalem," Elisheba observed. "But there were a lot more of us living in it." "Yes, my husband's family used to be bigger. I think many of them died while he was in Egypt." Elisheba smiled bashfully. "Also, it appears that Jeroboam is more, well, prosperous." Sarah laughed. "Yes, we're very blessed. This is a good place to live, and he is prosperous. But," she swallowed hard, "I miss my mother." Suddenly, Elisheba's eyes also filled with tears, and she was unable to speak. When Jeroboam and the other men returned that evening, the girls were eager to hear the news. "What happened today? Did you see Prince Rehoboam? Is there going to be a coronation?" Sarah asked. Stop, one at a time," Jeroboam laughed. "The men of Israel gathered all together, and yes, Rehoboam was there. The elders presented some of our concerns to him. The economy has been terrible for the common people here in Israel, and even though wealth has poured into the country during Solomon's reign and he was very prosperous, not much of it has filtered down to ordinary people. Toward the end of his reign, taxes just went up, and people are hardly able to bear it. The elders petitioned Rehoboam to lower our taxes and relieve the burden on us." Grandfather Nathan shook his head. "In the old days," he said, "there were no rich and poor in Israel. Some were more prosperous than others, but there was not such a division. That was before we had kings. Under the kings, the royal family and their favorites became very wealthy, and the poor became more destitute, and the gap between them became so large.
It is not that anyone wishes to take anything from those who are wealthy, but just to relieve the burden of taxation on those who are barely making it as it is."
"Well, what did he say?" Sarah asked. "Is he going to do it?"
Jeroboam shrugged. "He says he wants to talk with his advisors and he'll get back to us, so everyone is waiting to see what he decides."
"And you?"
Sarah looked pointedly at her husband. "I'm waiting too," he said. "The Lord will tell me what to do and when to do it, and until then I wait." Grandfather Nathan nodded and smiled. "That's all we can do." I was pleased, although I knew not everyone in their group was as willing to wait for the Almighty to fulfill his plans. The next day, several hours after Jeroboam left, the girls could hear shouting outside the walls of the compound.
"Summon the servants to help," Sarah exclaimed as the noise increased. "We must bar the entrance."
Unfortunately, the only ones home at the moment were only 2 elderly men, an older woman who was the cook, and 2 small children. Everyone else had gone to the public gathering for Rehoboam's coronation. They pushed the gates of the compound shut, and after struggling to put the heavy beam across it, they dragged over a few pieces of furniture and piled them against the gate. It was difficult for the girls to tell who was shouting in the streets and what they were saying. Sarah, Elisheba, and the servants clung to each other in a large central room at the back of the courtyard. They found themselves torn between trying to listen and trying not to hear what was going on so close to them.
"I thought I heard shouts of 'Long live King Rehoboam,'" Sarah said. "Then I thought I heard them say 'Jeroboam,' but now I don't know which." "Whatever it is, they're certainly angry," Elisheba said, swallowing hard. It seemed like hours before their men returned, and when they did, there were many others with them. They poured into the courtyard and stood gathered around the front gate. Jeroboam raised his hands, and some of the noise died down. "You have called on me to be your king," he said, "and I humbly accept." The crowd roared its approval. "Many years ago," he said, "the prophet Ahijah told me this would happen." He shared the story of Ahijah tearing his garment and telling him not to do anything before Solomon's death. "Now," he said, "Rehoboam has gone back to Jerusalem to gather an army, and we may have to fight. We need to pray and dedicate ourselves to the God of Israel, for we are Israel, whether we are 10 tribes or the previous 12. He is our God, and perhaps he can save us from war right now. And if not, then he will give us victory." The crowd roared its approval again.
"Long live Jeroboam!
"Long live Jeroboam!"
they yelled. Elisheba turned to Sarah.
"Sarah, if Jeroboam is the new king of Israel, you're the queen."
The older girl's chin dropped.
"Your Highness,"
Elisheba said, dropping on her knees before Sarah.
"Don't be silly. Get up," Sarah insisted. "You're my best friend. I'll have other people for servants and slaves. You're my companion." "As you wish, Your Highness," Elisheba said with a smile.
This broadcast has come from the book Exile of the Chosen by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.